Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we are taking on a topic that sits right at the intersection of, well, corporate policy and very personal crisis. We're talking about the return to work process, specifically after an absence for mental health or an invisible illness.
And it's an incredibly rich area to look into.
Yeah.
The sources you've shared with us for this are, frankly, exceptional. They give us two vastly different but equally critical perspectives.
Right.
On one hand, you have the formal institutional guidance from ACAS, that's the UK's Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service. And right next to it, we have this profoundly detailed personal account of navigating sick leave.
For burnout prevention and a late life ADHD diagnosis.
Exactly.
And that dual perspective is really what makes this so valuable. Our mission today is specifically for you, the learner behind the hyperfocus.co.uk initiative. We're diving into these sources to find those essential nuggets. How should the formal structure work? And then what does the individual have to do to advocate for themselves?
That's the core tension, isn't it? It's the contrast between the policy, which is all about objective process, and the soul, the messy, subjective reality of recovery. And when those two things meet, that's where you see what works and where the employee really has to step up and lead their own recovery.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think we should start with the formal structure. The bedrock of this whole process, according to ACAS, is the return to work meeting, the RTW meeting. What is that exactly? Is it as formal as it sounds?
Not really, no. ACAS describes it as typically an informal chat, often just between the employee and their line manager. But its importance, well, it far outweighs how informal it feels. It's essential best practice.
Essential, okay. But is it a legal thing? Does it have to happen?
So having the meeting itself isn't a strict legal requirement in the UK. But, and this is key, if an organization has an absence policy, which they pretty much all do, that policy should mandate this process. It's how the employer shows they're fulfilling their duty of care.
Right. So if it's a chat, what's on the employer's checklist during that conversation?
ACAS gives 4 main goals. The first one is pretty straightforward. Just confirming the employee is genuinely ready to come back to work. They'll look at the medical evidence for that.
And we should probably clarify for everyone listening that medical evidence in the UK often means a fit note.
Precisely. The fit note comes from a doctor, and it gives a recommendation. Is the person fit for work, or maybe fit for work with some adjustments? And that leads right into the third main goal, which is assessing support needs and agreeing on a concrete plan.
Like a phased return or something.
Exactly like a phased return. The second goal is more organizational.
Getting them up to speed.
Yeah. Catching the employee up on any critical work updates from while they were away. It helps reduce that feeling of overwhelm. But let's go back to that third goal, support, because that's where invisible illness demands so much more nuance. And the fourth goal is just as critical, confidentiality.
Deciding what to tell the rest of the team.
The employer has to agree with the employee what gets shared and what stays private.
That control over your own story must be incredibly important, especially when you're dealing with something that, still carries a stigma.
It's vital. And the policy source is really clear on this next point. If the illness qualifies as a disability, and mental health conditions often can, then the employer has a non-negotiable duty to discuss reasonable adjustments.
Let's explore that for a second. With, say, a broken leg, the adjustments are visible. A ramp, maybe a different chair. But with an invisible illness like late-life ADHD in a leadership role, what do reasonable adjustments even look like?
And that is the challenge. That's why the ACAS guidance alone isn't enough without the personal story. The adjustments shift from physical needs to cognitive and environmental ones. For ADHD, it could be flexible start times, maybe to work with medication. It could be a private office or noise-canceling tech, even changing communication styles away from messy email chains.
So the employer has to look for these underlying issues, but the policy says the employee doesn't have to disclose their diagnosis.
That's the tension. They have to be sensitive, maybe suggest a referral to occupational health. Occupational health can then recommend adjustments without disclosing all the private medical details. But here's the key insight from the personal account. Sometimes, choosing to be vulnerable and open is actually the best strategy for getting the specific support you really need.
That's a perfect bridge, because before that conversation even happens, both sides have to prepare. Let's talk about that self-advocacy piece.
The employer's prep is logistics. Find a private room, get the records together. But for the employee, the preparation is psychological. It's strategic. You have to be brutally honest with yourself about what needs to change. You can't ask for an adjustment if you haven't figured out what caused the burnout.
And this preparation is what led to the 6-week absence in our personal source. It was proactive, it was explicitly aimed at preventing a full collapse. That shows just an incredible level of self-awareness.
It does, but it was hard won. The account details a year on SSRIs, antidepressants, and therapy going all the way back to 2010. This is a long-term battle.
And then the seismic shift, the late-life ADHD diagnosis post-50. That's not just learning something new about yourself, that's fundamentally rewriting your life story.
The specifics are so powerful. 9 out of 9 for the inattentive type, 5 out of 9 for hyperactive impulsive. That high score in inattentiveness over decades,
Yep.
it just explains so much. That feeling of inadequacy, of constantly dropping balls.
And this manifested as a really profound internal conflict. I mean, here's someone running a GP organization, a demanding leadership role, while feeling like a complete fraud, wrestling with this invisible neurological difference in a job where, the internal chaos didn't match the sedentary nature of the work.
It's a classic conflict for high achievers with late diagnosed ADHD.
Mhm.
They build their whole career on masking and just sheer effort. So when that system collapses into burnout, the identity crisis is just immense. They feel fraudulent because their main tool, their focus, is malfunctioning. An employer needs to grasp this context if the RTW meeting is going to be anything more than just a formality.
So you've done the self-discovery, the policy framework is there. How do you decide you're actually ready to go back? ACUS is looking for a fit note, but our source used a purely internal emotional metric.
Yeah, the personal marker was, and I'm quoting here, waiting until the thought of work didn't make me angry. Think about that. The employer wants objective evidence, but the employee is waiting for that subjective feeling of dread to just dissipate. That emotional threshold is often way more reliable than a date on a piece of paper.
That makes so much sense. And the plan was a phased return, half days at first. But the most revealing part for me was the discussion of boundaries during the time off. When the illness is invisible, there's, as they say, no rule book.
This is where that self-advocacy became so crucial. They had to create their own rules, and those rules were tough. Canceling social events, even a gig at Rock City, and canceling the team festive lunch. The principle was, if the stress is work-related and I can't be at work, then I shouldn't be at work social functions either.
That festive lunch decision is fascinating. It must have been so hard to enforce that clean break when you're so invested in your team. Why was that so necessary?
It maintains the sanctity of the sick leave. The moment you go to a social thing with colleagues, the lines blur. People ask questions, you feel like you have to explain yourself, and suddenly you are mentally right back in the environment you needed to escape from. The conclusion they reached was that common sense should prevail, which really just means you have to define the boundary that stops that emotional leakage back into the workplace.
Okay, here's my challenge, though. The use of the sick leave was incredibly active. They threw themselves into learning about ADHD, started the hyperfocus.co.uk website. If the goal is to prevent burnout, isn't it kind of contradictory to immediately start another huge project?
That is the core paradox of the ADHD brain, isn't it? The drive to do is relentless, especially when hyperfocus kicks in. And the source realized this. They noted they had to slow down the website development because it was threatening to become another job. But the difference lies in control and purpose. Starting the website was therapeutic. It was self-directed. It wasn't driven by someone else's deadlines.
So the activity itself wasn't the problem, but the intensity needed the same kind of monitoring as returning to work.
Exactly. They were using the time more intentionally, shifting from what they called just motoring on.
No.
But this kind of intense break can create another hurdle, the confidence challenge.
Yeah, the insecurity that builds up when people get used to you not being there.
It's very real.
Mm-hmm.
If your identity is tied to doing, then not doing makes you feel irrelevant. You start to fear the machine is running fine without you. The strategy here, imposing that clean break it, allowed them to feel like they truly earned their phased return, not like they were just sneaking back in.
Okay, let's look at the long-term strategies. The things put in place to make sure this was a permanent fix, not just a pause.
The plan is really comprehensive, and it's all targeted at the root cause, the unmanaged ADHD. 4 key things stand out. First, just getting a real intellectual grip on the diagnosis. Second, getting an ADHD coach, which is very practical, skill-based support. Third, continuing with regular therapy. And fourth, and this is the critical leadership piece,
Talking openly with the team.
talking openly with the team about the challenges and the new abilities.
That fourth point is just so powerful for a leader. You spend your career being the pillar for everyone else, and now you have to deliberately dismantle that a bit to give yourself the same compassion you give your team.
It's the realization that self-compassion isn't a weakness. It's a fundamental leadership requirement. By showing that vulnerability, they're basically establishing psychological safety for everyone else. They're validating the struggles of their team by showing their own.
So, if we synthesize all of this, the structured advice from ACUS and this deeply honest personal roadmap, what are the definitive takeaways for you, the listener?
I'd say it's a message of dual responsibility. ACAS confirms the employer has a structure and a duty of care, but the personal journey confirms the employee has an equally vital duty to self-advocacy. You have to be honest about what needs to change.
And both sources seem to warn against the exact same risk.
They do. The risk of returning too soon or without an adequate plan, because you'll just have to step back again. The personal account sums it perfectly. The goal is to be less a human doing and more a human being. Your ability to work is secondary to your ability to live a healthy life.
That duality, the formal requirement to provide support and the personal requirement to define it, that's the heart of it all.
Absolutely. A successful return hinges on both parties fulfilling their duty of care. The RTW meeting gives you the structure, but personal advocacy, setting boundaries and being honest about what you need, especially with an invisible late diagnosed condition, that's the true engine of recovery.
So, considering the late diagnosis, the self-knowledge, and this incredible initiative you've launched, hyperfocus.co.uk, here's a final provocative thought for you to explore. You mentioned allowing colleagues in more on my challenges and abilities. Now that you understand the mechanics of your own ADHD, what novel insights, what enhanced abilities might this self-knowledge bring to your leadership? How does this deeper understanding of your own brain actually make you a stronger, more empathetic, and ultimately more effective leader than you were before the burnout?
Think on how vulnerability can become your greatest professional strength.
Thank you for sharing these incredibly powerful sources with us. We encourage you to explore these concepts further. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.